The Deathslinger is a killer that deals in exceptions. Most killers can't reasonably get a hit through the backside of Shack, but Deathslinger is an exception to that. In some ways, perfecting those exceptions makes Slinger as deadly as the nurse in 1v1 scenarios. Now, finding those exceptions comes down to practice, pattern recognition, and insane people like Late Night Nomad and Comrade Cheese who test literally every hitbox on maps for hours on end because DBD is a game that always works as designed.
Oh, shit. I just found something crazy.
Unfortunately, due to Dead by Daylight's inconsistent environment hitboxes, the narrowest shots that you can possibly land are entirely map dependent. It might be possible to shoot through this crack on Dead Dog Saloon, or this one on Autohaven Wreckers, or this one sometimes on the Orman Locker tiles. I have learned these exceptions through hundreds of games of Deathslinger, but the logic for more general use is much simpler, and I'm going to over-explain it anyway to make sure that I leave nothing out. Let's start with explaining why those narrow shots work by breaking down the hitbox of the Pyre itself, using the default Redeemer model for the most clarity. When the Deathslinger fires the Redeemer, the spear itself has a roughly 2 cm in diameter environmental hitbox, making it about the size of a quarter on your screen or a closely equivalent large coin in your local currency. It's more like shooting a high-powered railroad spike, which would be pretty thematically accurate, than the broader spear model that we actually have in-game. Now, what I've observed is, like a railroad spike, the environmental hitbox extends behind the tip to where the spear visually connects to the chain. It's more like a long cylinder than a flat circular hitbox that checks what it hits. This is why the spear will bounce off of tall obstacles that the Deathslinger can otherwise shoot over if the Deathslinger player is standing too close. When you move too close to the wall, the gun model itself clips into whatever you're aiming at, making the back of the cylindrical hitbox spawn inside of the obstacle when fired. Unfortunately, this does harm the cylinder. This is easy to do by mistake because the rifle model itself has no collision, allowing Slinger to push the nose of the spear into places it would collide with otherwise. A shot like this isn't inaccurate per se, it's getting caught because of the angle. That all seems a bit high concept, but I promise it's important for understanding how your shots land. I also have a theory that this is why the hit registration bug still exists, because the server disagrees with the alignment of the cylinder across its entire length instead of just giving the tip full priority. I promise this isn't an innuendo. This is also why lower angle shots feel like they need to be more precise, because the angle is unfavorable for a cylindrical object. Anyway, when a survivor drops a pallet or vaults a window, it's very easy to shoot them over it because of the empty space above it. That's simple enough. And we can extend that very simple logic to literally anything with a dip in its height. What this means is that I see an entire map in terms of the quality of items that can be shot over. On the Groaning Storehouse, this collection of boxes are low enough to catch even a crouching survivor. And then this logic continues for every obstacle that you don't have to tilt your camera up past 90 degrees for, or anything that you can see a survivor cosmetic over. Slight dips in rock formations, the irregular gaps on Toba Landing's filler tiles, and even some shots where you actually can't see the survivor completely. Things like these wagons on Dead Dog Saloon, the hay bales on the Coldwind maps, the planter boxes on Larry's, and the cars on Badham Preschool. The reason why these shots work are because survivor hitboxes are pill-shaped and not tight to their model. The hitbox actually rounds out over top of their heads and sits slightly behind them. Therefore, the cylindrical hitbox of the Redeemer's spear is narrow enough to skirt over top of these tall obstacles and clip the survivor's crude hitbox, because DBD is a game that always works as designed. The second part of learning how to utilize Deathslinger is tied to survivor movement, and something that I call corralling. Since Deathslinger fires a projectile and not a hit scan weapon, a lot of shots have to do with predicting how a survivor will move based on a variety of clues. I know that I've explained this before, but I'll repeat it here for the sake of consistency. When the Deathslinger aims down sights with the default weapon, there's the central crosshair and then the 2 prongs that extend out to either side. Most of the other guns have these indicators too, but due to the model differences, they're often obscured and harder to see. The default gun is also the only one that fires the cylinder at the tip of the central crosshair, while every other model is bumped up higher and fires below the tip by a considerable amount. So if you're looking to how to aim precisely with a gun that doesn't clutter your screen, I'd suggest starting with the default gun. And since people ask me about it all the time, the Iron Maiden skin is actually off-center on its crosshair, a little bit to the right, so you really have to be paying attention to the tip and not the glowing green box on top of it. You can't unequip this weapon from this set, by the way, and you have to pay $15 for the whole thing. Nice. When you're aiming at a survivor in the distance, if they're running at a diagonal angle away from you, you line up the outer prong with their model's back. If they're running perpendicularly in front of you, line up the prong with their head instead. And then we get the exceptions where survivors tend to dodge. Here's the most common example. A survivor is at a distance, clearly looking at you, and running against a wall. In this case, you should aim as if they're running perpendicular to you, and they will almost always run into the spear when you take this shot. For survivors that dodge based on reaction times and do a little lazy half spin on their toes, aim directly at them instead of in front of them, since they'll accidentally dodge back into the spear then. Of course, every survivor plays the game a little bit differently, so you may have to adjust your aim based on how somebody dodges, but it should be pretty easy to pick up because most survivors don't change their movement patterns, and you can learn it pretty quickly. Survivors that crouch every time you aim either make it easy to make distance on them, or you can just shoot them where they're crouching because they're literally standing still. Now in this clip here, I've recognized the narrow gap on this tile that I can shoot over, but the angle that I have to position myself at to land the shot is also dependent on when the survivor crosses in front of that gap, and they aren't going to calmly stand there and wait for me. Quite often what I'll do instead is change directions mid-chase with the intention of corralling a survivor towards that gap so that the positioning favors me better. What I'm trying to explain here, conceptually, is that Deathslinger doesn't need to be restricted to getting injuries purely through animation locks, and that by merely seeing the map in terms of the quantity of items that can be shot over, you can make virtually any tile unplayable because Deathslinger is a killer that deals in exceptions. Now you might be able to shoot over pallets, but you can actually shoot under them too. Shots that go underneath things are a lot less common since they often require that you stand a further distance away due to the less favorable angles at close ranges. But they can often be easier to hit because survivors don't expect them as often. Dead Dog Saloon is the easiest example for this, as you can shoot under every upright wagon on the map, as well as through every crack on Shack's non-windowed side, except for these two, which I'll get to talking about later. These exceptions also mean that Deathslinger can invalidate both of the pallets on Toba Landing's main building if the Deathslinger is patient enough. Also, since shooting underneath this window on Toba is possible, you can catch the survivor as they're falling and strafe to get a guaranteed hit here off the ramp. This is possible for any window that can be shot under, like the window on the Hawkins map or this variation of the bus tile on Autohaven maps. So now you understand that I see the map in terms of not just what can be shot over, but also what can be shot under in case I need more options or a survivor thinks they're safe by crouching behind something. And that leads us to the all-important question of what can I shoot through? Well, that's where you start getting into very map and even patch specific questions. Since DBD is a game that always works as designed, there are always massive exceptions everywhere with those that have the autism to find them, like Late Night Nomad, whom you should pester to make more videos because they're really well made, and he has a nice voice, and he's single because he won't return my call. To give you an example, do you see that gap? It's right there, in the corner of Swamp Shack building. Here, let me zoom in. Do you see it now? Well, let me highlight it for you, and zoom back out. That's how narrow it gets. While this is a rare shot to land, this corner can be utilized against any survivor that's trying to hold this corner as a check spot. In the case of being able to shoot through some solid floors, again depending on the patch, the Deathslinger main community has the assumption that Dead by Daylight has a slight margin of error exception for some of its hitboxes, where it gives the benefit of the doubt to Deathslinger's harpoon. Therefore, on some materials that are extremely thin sheets of metal, the game assumes that it shouldn't be blocking this shot. The same went for the catwalk on Ormond Lake Mine for a bit, but things like this do get patched eventually, like how fellow Deathslinger main Kestner explained that Swamp Shack walls had zero collision with projectiles. Shots like these should be impossible in any reality, so it's reasonable that they're patched eventually. Anyway, this shot on the Swamp Shack, which was discovered before the most recent wall bug, is arguable for how narrow it is, but the logic is pretty consistent with similar gaps on Autohaven maps, Cold Winds maps, and even these tiny cracks on Suffocation Pit's main building. Even this cart on the Cold Wind maps can be shot through. and the hitbox on the metal grate is so precise that the chain stops colliding with the cart when it's being pulled through the empty gaps, which is a pretty cool attention to detail. So that begs the question, why in the entity's realm is this shot out front of RPD's main lobby or behind the statue's spear completely blocked? Well, in order to help explain these hitboxes a little more, I brought in a friend who has been working with Unreal Engine for quite some time now. For the sake of the audience, would you be able to introduce yourself and then kind of explain what your level of experience is with Unreal Engine?
Yeah, hi, I'm CloneFrog. I am an occasional DBD streamer. I have been using the Unreal Engine since 2005, 2006. And so ever since then, I have been familiar with Unreal Engine going from 2 to 3 to UDK, which is like a standalone Unreal 3 editor that Epic released, and then Unreal 4, Unreal 5. I hold a Epic Games Game Design Professional Certificate, and I am also in the Unreal Authorized Instructor Program. I want to fully state that everything that I say here regarding DBD should be taken with a grain of salt, because I don't know the objective truth of how these things are working in DBD or why behavior makes the decisions they do. I'm just making very educated guesses.
One of the things that DBD kind of does a little bit strangely, a conversation that had popped up between the two of us, was collision maps, and how DBD apparently uses what you said were low accuracy collision maps. I guess kind of layman's terms, would you be able to explain what collision maps are and maybe why companies would choose to use it for optimization or speed?
Most people know them as hitboxes. People who work in Unreal, or probably a lot of other game engines, use something similar. We call them collision meshes. Let's say you have a character model and you have two different versions of a collision mesh for it. You have one that is like perfectly matches the polygons of the character mesh. It's 100,000 triangles. And then the other one, you have like a simple capsule with a couple arms that's maybe 20 polygons. Games work by running their logic every single frame. So every single time a frame is rendered in your game, that is it completing its instruction set for that frame. The CPU has processed everything, it sent the instructions to your GPU, and your GPU has sent the image to your monitor. And it does that every single time a frame refreshes. This is why running a game at higher frame rates is usually a little more intensive than running it at lower frame rates. So if you have a mesh that has a collision mesh on it that is 100,000 polys, every single frame that the game renders, your CPU is basically going through every single one of those 100,000 polygons and checking if there is something intersecting with it, which is why it's in the best interest for performance to have really low quality collision meshes.
Right, so to summarize, really that means that low accuracy collision maps, even if they're not the best in terms of gameplay feel, I mean, I know we both know how Nostromo Wreckage feels to play on. You get caught on literally everything, it feels like, on that map. But it would be more beneficial in terms of optimization for people on lower end machines, is what you're getting at.
Correct.
Would you believe, possibly, this is very pointed, that older maps have more precise collision because they were created and smoothed out before the Switch version of the game released, because of how much optimization the Switch version of the game requires?
Yeah, I think that the Switch version required them to do a lot of work to get that version going. Behavior have crossplay with Switch players, which means things like collision geometry needs to be matched across the different versions of the game. What I believe led to it is not necessarily like they got lazy. I know a lot of people will say that. I don't think that they got lazy. I think it's because the AAA industry, especially for live service games right now, is very fast. It's very brutal, and you are basically expected to cut as many corners as is feasible in order to keep up steady production of new content. The engine itself is fine. It's the workflow that goes into these games and just how horrible and crunched and rushed they often tend to be. Well, I mean, look at the 10th anniversary livestream and everything that they revealed that they're working on. They're working on all of that stuff while still working to keep up a consistent content drop. And so they probably are cutting as many corners as they can in order to make sure that they can get that all out. Do not blame the developers for this. A lot of this is due to executive decisions.
Like you said, it's only educated guesses and only so far that we can take it, but I do appreciate your insight and being able to provide some answers in a more definitive tone that I could kind of, poke a stick at the end of the day. So again, I very much appreciate your time, and thanks for joining me for this part of the video.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, it's not exactly concrete evidence because digging through the game files is a complicated, possibly account-compromising affair, but it is the most thorough explanation that I can find as to why some shots don't work when they should. But that does simplify things somewhat. When I look for shots that I can land, I look for gaps over, under, or through every obstacle, and time it with when I know that a survivor will pass in front of that gap. If the shot bounces when I know that it clearly wouldn't on other examples, I know that it's either a result of me standing too close, or the map is a newer one and just has bad collision. Or I missed. That happens too. The second important part of Deathslinger's power is positioning. You can land a spear shot, but in a lot of the situations, the more complicated part is getting it down. So let's say that a survivor is holding distance away from you and the pallet has been dropped. Even though it is technically possible to land a shot anywhere along this tile, the chain will break faster than a hit can be landed. So therefore, simpler shots like these are only possible when the positioning cuts out most of the obstacle that surrounds the pallet. This is also why gap shots are so important, because they are Deathslinger's best form of lethality. Realistically, all that Deathslinger is trying to do with his power is immediately shorten the length of any and every tile in the game, and without that capability, he doesn't have a power, and he generally gets worse with each new map and map revision, because behavior won't be bothered to fix collision maps that only stand to benefit a killer that's lost the popularity contest. If anything, behavior might only fix the collision maps if Jason is getting screwed by them. Personal gripes and complaints aside though, here are a few examples of my full thought process when it comes to landing a shot with the Deathslinger. Okay, so this first clip's pretty simple. It has like a little two-piece follow-up here, but we'll see just how this unfolds. So initially, this Sable is running at a diagonal away from me. We're relatively close to each other. I'd say the distance is maybe 8 meters, 10 meters at most. She's running at a diagonal, but most importantly, we see that her head is facing back towards me. So what I know that that means is that she is likely at this range to start running back this direction, right? Which means that instead of aiming directly at her, I need to aim more like directly behind her here. And if we clear all of our lines off here and then also play the clip back, you can see that I aim as if she is running in a perpendicular direction, because I'm pretty certain with the way that she's looking that she's going to try and go back. And so I get the prediction right. I get that first hit off. I nod at her a little bit because 1v1 at Shaq, that's kind of a pretty ballsy name. And then I recognize on this platform here, I know that these rocks on the Dead Sands that are also on Eyrie of Crows has a slight divot right about here. And that is something that if I time it well and I just understand how Survivor's run speed works going around the back of a rock, that they will eventually go around behind that crack and I can shoot him over top of it. So I was actually in a Discord call with a friend of mine while I was playing this game, a couple of friends, and I remember thinking like, oh, I'm going to hit a nice clip here because I know what I can shoot over. So I go like this, I reload, I think I need to go around this way, but then I realize, oh, the timing isn't right, because right now I think Sable's kind of here, if I'm not mistaken. Like Sable, if we can, she's like right about here right now. By the time that I ADS and can kind of get over this gap, which is a little bit narrow right now in this corner, I'm not going to be able to hit her. So instead of trying to play around that, I instead kind of double back, and I see her here. Now, I know even if I aim down sights right now at her as well, I'm not going to be able to hit this shot. Maybe if I kept holding W, I could have hit her eventually, but we would have ended up at the pallet. So instead, I see her here. I know the time that it takes for her to go around the back of the rock. And of course, I aim at the gap up here because I know that that's where her hitbox, if we make it in blue, is going to show up, because it's a little bit taller than that gap. So once we have it around there, you'll see that I'm going to be able to hit this shot right here because she's running forwards. Her hitbox, which we had in blue before, curves out right over top here. And I'm able to hit her just like that. Real nice and simple. and get her down. The second example I have is starts a bit weird because the team here has a shadow step boon and I don't know exactly where it is, and so I lose track of this guy because we both drop down the hole, but because he has shadow step I assume that he had run around the corner or something along those lines. So you're gonna see me go around and then I see him here, I'm like, oh okay, he's been healing here this entire time. And I recognize pretty much immediately that there is actually a feasible gap in between these bits of barbed wire and fences that have fallen over that goes right down the center. And so I do kind of the same thing that I did with the Sable around this pallet. I think like, oh, maybe I can hit through. I'm actually looking at this gap here initially, thinking that maybe if I ADS in time while Dwight goes in front of this, I can actually hit him there, but it's not going to work. I know that the timing isn't going to exactly work out, so instead of trying to force this gap specifically, I go around the backside until I can actually get it here. And from there, it's a pretty simple follow-up. So in this case, I was mostly just recognizing where I had that gap here, instead of also including the prediction shot. I just kind of knew. I wanted to go for this because I knew that there was a gap through this, and I just had to be a little bit patient with the movement. Now, thankfully, with this obstacle, unlike the rock with Sable, I can see the Dwight the entire time as he's crossing in front of it. So this does make this a little bit easier, but it's still very hard to predict from the survivor side if you don't know that Slinger can shoot through this gap, and it makes it a much more easy gap for Slinger to hit because survivors will always run in front of your crosshairs because they can't see you aiming down sights when you're behind all this pile of junk, and they're probably panicking because they're on death hook anyway. And this last one's just a clip that I had gathered a little while ago, but it is one that is a pretty simple concept to follow. We're on Dead Dog Saloon. I try and think that, oh, Fungmin's going behind the, I think this might be her head here, I'm not entirely sure, but she's going behind this wagon here, and I do the usual kind of aim down sights over top of it. I actually aim a little bit too high on that, so I do end up missing by a narrow margin. It's whatever, but then I think, if aiming over top is going to be difficult because she might crouch and everything, why don't I try to actually go underneath this wagon here? Because I know that this hitbox is something that is valuable. Now, the other cool thing, like we mentioned before about hitboxes going underneath things, is that it makes it a lot harder for survivors to see you. But you can actually see for a very brief second, and we'll highlight this in blue, you can see Fungmin's feet here and also kind of like her shadow as it is here. And because I know that I can shoot underneath pretty much all of this, aside from where the wheels are, obviously, I can then hit her. And she's kind enough to not realize that we're aiming because her vision is obscured by being behind the wagon, that we can hit her while she's standing still behind the pallet. And we actually get the down too, which is pretty cool. That's my third example of things that you can shoot under, over, and through with the Deathslinger. Hope this was a good little example for you to understand just how deadly this killer can be, and that the rest of the video was informative for you as well.
And that is a drastic over-explanation of how I play the Deathslinger, or how to think like a Deathslinger main. Exploring holes with an older man. If this guide was helpful, feel free to like the video. If you dislike the video, then I'm afraid we're going to have to ruin your hitbox. If you want to see your name at the end of the videos like I have here now, feel free to toss me $1 on my Ko-Fi page. Thanks for watching, safe travels, and goodbye.